If you're short on time in the gym, or maybe you don't necessarily have the space within your program to add some dedicated mobility drills, whether in your warm-up or your cool-down, here are some ways you can interject hip mobility into the strength and hypertrophy exercises you're already doing. Now, there's many different ways we can address this and different body parts we can target, but I want to make this video in context to improving hip internal rotation, basically because I think hip internal rotation is extremely important. And not only will hip internal rotation get your hips feeling good in every other direction, but you'll be able to train your glutes through their full range of motion, and it may even result in better strength and muscle mass increases if you're able to access full hip internal rotation. Now, there's a lot of research out there showing that muscles respond best to a hypertrophy stimulus when we're biasing the muscles in their lengthened position and choosing exercises that are hardest in the fully stretched position, then we can get greater hypertrophy gains as well as flexibility changes. So let's talk about this in context to the glutes. So the glutes, they extend the hip and they externally rotate the hip. So in order to fully stretch them, we need to move through hip flexion and internal rotation. With the feet on the ground, this is going to look like this, a hinge pattern with a hip shift toward the working side leg. So this pelvis over femur internal rotation will fully stretch the glutes at the bottom here. Here's how we can use this concept in some of the exercises we're doing for our lower body. So I'm going to show you 3 of my favorite lower body exercises that you're probably already doing. It's going to be a hip thrust variation, a hinge variation, and a split squat variation. But you can add a subtle tweak to these exercises to not only make better improvements in your glute hypertrophy training, but also improve hip internal rotation. Now, after you do a set of each of these exercises, you should test and retest your hip internal rotation before and after. And after you do a set of some of these exercises, you should notice significant improvements in your hip internal rotation. Now, we've all used hip thrusts to both build and strengthen our glutes, but when we perform them with a single leg, it gives us this opportunity to add this hip shift toward the working side so we can mobilize internal rotation in the bottom position and get that full stretch each rep. So as I initiate hip flexion, I'm thinking about turning my belly button toward this working side, and I can use my other leg to push into internal rotation to draw the pelvis to that side as well. Now notice I'm not turning my pelvis so much that the whole femur is moving with it and I just dump the weight to the side. I'm keeping pressure of the inner arch of my foot on the ground as I try to turn that pelvis toward the working side. Okay, some compensations you'll see with this motion is if you're turning too much, you'll fall to the outside arch of your foot, and that's how you know you're moving out of internal rotation. Okay, so perform this nice and controlled with a full stretch at the bottom. So the alignment cue we're looking for at the bottom is belly button in line with the working kneecap. Now, I really like using weights held in the opposite hand to the working side leg, because what this does is it turns the pelvis over to the working side. So the weight being held on my right side will turn my pelvis over to the left into internal rotation. So here's a split stance or a kickstand hinge with a hip internal rotation bias. So I'm going to get in a split stance. The back leg is just simply there for balance and more points of contact on the ground so we can fully focus on loading that front leg. So I'm going to hold the weight in the opposite arm. I'm going to keep a slight knee bend. I'm going to shift my hips back. As I'm going down into the range, I'm going to think about turning my pelvis across so that my belly button lines up with the working side knee. Keep that slight knee bend and extend the hip forward. So it's important to not just start with a fully hip shifted position, because now we have no more space to actually move into internal rotation, and you'll notice that this femur just bows out into external rotation, and then my weight kind of is placed on the outside edge of my foot. And so it's important to just make it one smooth movement, start in a neutral position. As we hinge, toward the bottom, start to rotate that pelvis, and we should feel a huge stretch in the posterior lateral hip. And this is that glute stretching. Now, it's important when we do this, I like to keep a slight knee bend here. So when we hinge, we're not using our quads and squatting into it. We're keeping the motion isolated completely to the hip. And you don't need to go very low with this. There's a lot of people that just bring that weight to the floor, but they're not really moving through their hip. They're moving through their lumbar spine. So for me, I keep that slight knee bend, shoot my hips up and back, and my weight is really only going toward my mid-shin here. And then from there, I keep the knee slightly bent and extend the hip. And next we have a front foot elevated split squat, again with a contralateral weight, or weight held in the opposite hand. Now I like to use a slight front foot elevation because this is going to place us in a little bit more hip flexion, which is going to bias some more internal rotation. So same concepts apply here. We don't want to just max out internal rotation at the start because now my knee is going to track over my pinky toes and it's going to move into external rotation. So we want to keep this knee tracking over the big toe, and we want to keep our pressure through the inner arch of our foot. And we want to descend straight down as we get toward the bottom, slowly turning our pelvis toward the working side leg. Feel that stretch each rep and press through the inner arch of the foot to come back out of it. Okay, we can add a slight pause at the bottom there. Feel that stretch each rep. And not only do we get a good mobilization out of this, but we get much more burn in the back of our hip. So give these 3 exercises a try. These are some of my favorite exercises to use, especially with some of my clients dealing with hip impingement or FAI in their later stages of rehab when their hip isn't so flared up. So be smart with these if you do have hip pain, and don't ever push into any pain, as hip internal rotation can sometimes be very irritable for people with hip impingement. But that being said, some of these movements really helped my own hips. And if you're interested in the way I train and how I train my clients by combining strength and flexibility work, then please reach out. I offer online coaching based on a personal assessment and your own goals, where we can customize a plan to get you moving and feeling great.